The sun had dipped low across the plains, stretching the sky into a canvas of fire and gold as the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the lonely sound of a woman's song, a voice trembling yet tender, breaking through the stillness of a weather-beaten cabin on the edge of nowhere. Inside, a young woman sat hunched forward on a rocking chair, her hands clenched in her lap as she hummed softly to an empty cradle, her auburn hair falling loose over her shoulders, her eyes glistening with the kind of sorrow only a mother who had lost could ever know. And it was there, in the raw ache of that moment, that a cowboy with dust still clinging to his boots and trail on his skin stopped in his tracks, hat in hand watching her, his chest tightening as if her grief had reached out and tangled with his own heart. For he knew loss, he knew emptiness, and he knew the weight of silence that followed when someone you loved was gone. He stepped softly, his spurs barely whispering against the old floorboards, and she startled, her song breaking off, her gaze flying up to meet his, fear flickering for a moment before she recognized the kindness in his eyes, that deep steadiness that seemed carved out of storms and hard years, and before she could speak his voice came low, rough like gravel but steady. "You don't have to sing alone anymore," he said, moving closer, kneeling beside the cradle as if honoring what had been lost, his calloused hand brushing the edge of the wood worn smooth from nights of rocking. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks then, the words tumbling out of her about how she had prayed, how she had waited, how her arms had been left empty when life had been stolen from her child, how the silence in this cabin had grown heavier than she could bear. And he listened, not interrupting, not offering hollow comfort, but letting her grief pour into the open air where it belonged. And when she could no longer speak, when her breath was shaking, and her sobs had quieted into trembling silence, he placed his hand gently over hers and whispered the words that would change the course of her life forever. "We can fill it again, darlin'. We can fill it with love, with laughter, with little footsteps, running through this cabin and fields, outside if you'll let me stay, if you'll let me be the man to build that dream beside you." And she stared at him, disbelieving, because no one had ever spoken such promises without strings. No one had ever looked at her brokenness and seen it as something beautiful to carry. Yet there he was, a cowboy weathered by the world but unshaken in his vow, holding her hand as if it were the most sacred thing he'd ever touched. She searched his face for deceit, but all she found was honesty carved deep, a man who had seen darkness but still chose the light. And slowly her heart, cracked and fragile, began to beat with something she hadn't felt in years: hope. They rose together, his arm around her as she leaned into the steady strength of his frame, and he told her of the land he worked, the horses he raised, the dreams he had carried alone for far too long, dreams he had buried until the moment he walked into this cabin and heard her voice, carrying a lullaby to the heavens. And she realized that her song had not been sung in vain, for it had reached the one heart strong enough to hear it. And as the evening deepened into night, stars spilling across the sky like spilled silver, they stood by that cradle together, no longer empty but alive with promise. And though the road ahead would be long, though scars would remain, they knew the greatest love. Stories weren't written in perfection, but in second chances, in the courage to rebuild and in the faith that what was broken could bloom again. And so, dear listener, if this story has moved you, if you believe in love that heals, in cowboys who keep their word, and in women strong enough to sing through their pain, then stay with us, subscribe to this channel, and be part of every tale we tell. Because like that cowboy's promise, there are more stories waiting to fill the empty places in all of us, stories that remind us we're never truly alone, and together we'll keep riding toward the light. The morning sun spilled through the cabin window, brushing the wooden floor with streaks of light as if the heavens themselves wanted to bless a new beginning. And for the first time in years, she woke not to silence but to the sound of boots moving across her porch, steady, certain, the cowboy already outside tending to the land as though he had always belonged there. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, stepping quietly to the doorway, and watched him saddle his horse, his movements strong and practiced, each gesture carrying the weight of a man who knew both labor and loyalty. And she realized with a trembling heart that his promise had not been empty words, whispered in a tender night, but a vow he intended to keep with every sunrise. When he returned, brushing dust from his hat, their eyes met. And for the first time since the cradle had been left vacant, she allowed a smile to rise, fragile yet real, and he caught it like a treasure, grinning back with that easy warmth that seemed to mend every broken piece inside her. Over breakfast, they spoke of small things: fields that needed tending, horses that needed breaking, bread that needed baking. But beneath their simple words was something greater: the quiet weaving of two lives together, thread by thread, hope by hope. And as she poured him coffee, her hand brushed his, lingering longer than it once would have, and he covered it with his own, steady and sure, reminding her with that touch that she would never face emptiness alone again. Outside, the land stretched wide, untamed and wild.